gating you about your hypothetical startup. Chloe Adams muttered, her fingers aggressively shoving the crumpled check into the pocket of his slightly frayed tweed jacket. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel hummed with the oppressive chatter of New York's elite, a Shark Tank masquerading as a charity gala, and she desperately needed a shield against her family's relentless matchmaking. Sebastian Wright, the perpetually unbothered data programmer from her office, merely tilted his head, his chaotic dark hair falling over eyes that were an arresting, unreadable shade of jade. "For $500, sweetheart, I'll even let your father insult my vintage boots," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly hum that somehow cut through the string quartet's crescendo. Before Chloe could reprimand his casual use of pet names, the glittering crowd parted abruptly as Marcus Sterling, the ruthless titan of Sterling equities, strode toward them. Chloe instinctively braced herself, but Sterling didn't look at her, his face usually a mask of arrogant superiority drained of all color. To her utter disbelief, the billionaire stopped dead in his tracks and bowed at a rigid 90-degree angle directly toward her scruffy +1. "Sir, I had no idea you would be gracing us with your presence tonight," Sterling stammered, sweat visibly beading on his forehead under the crystal chandeliers. The sheer impossibility of the moment paralyzed Chloe, her analytical mind violently short-circuiting as she stared at the trembling titan of Wall Street, deferring to a guy who brought leftover pasta in Tupperware to the firm's break room. Sebastian didn't flinch, nor did he puff out his chest. Instead, a microscopic shift altered his entire demeanor, the lazy slouch tightening into a posture of terrifying coiled power for just a fraction of a second. "Marcus, you must have me confused with someone who actually cares about your golf handicap," Sebastian drawled smoothly, casually slipping his arm around Chloe's rigid waist and pulling her flush against his side. "I'm just here for the free champagne and to keep my beautiful girlfriend entertained." Sterling blinked, his terrified gaze darting between Sebastian's sharp morning glare and Chloe's bewildered face, before he abruptly forced a hollow, agonizingly fake laugh. "Of course, my apologies, a striking resemblance to someone else entirely," the older man choked out, practically tripping over his own expensive Oxfords as he beat a hasty, undignified retreat. Chloe felt the solid, radiating heat of Sebastian's body against hers, her pulse hammering a frantic rhythm as she tilted her head to glare up at him. "What in the actual hell was that?" she demanded in a furious whisper, her fingers digging into the worn fabric of his sleeve. "Rich old men have terrible eyesight, especially after their third martini," Sebastian countered with an effortless, lazy grin, his thumb drawing a slow, distracting circle against her hip bone. "He probably mistook me for that aggressive hedge fund manager who fired him in the 90s. But if you want your money back, I can always leave you to the wolves." He nodded toward the grand entrance, where Chloe's mother, Evelyn, was already scanning the room like a hawk seeking prey, flanked by her two equally ambitious aunts. They were hunting for Chloe, armed with a mental catalog of eligible, wealthy bachelors meant to elevate the Adams family's fading social status and secure their precarious financial future. "Don't you dare move," Chloe hissed, her survival instinct overriding her relentless need for logical explanations, pressing herself willingly into the protective arc of his arm. "Just smile, look poor but ambitious, and agree with whatever I say." As Evelyn spotted them and began her predatory glide across the marble floor, Sebastian leaned down, his lips brushing dangerously close to the sensitive shell of her ear. "I can play the ambitious pauper flawlessly, Chloe. but you're going to have to look at me like you actually tolerate my existence," he murmured, his breath a warm, minty caress that sent an involuntary shiver straight down her spine. "Chloe, darling, I was beginning to think you were hiding in the coat check again," Evelyn Adams announced loudly, her sharp gaze immediately conducting a ruthless head-to-toe autopsy of the man standing beside her daughter. "And who, pray tell, is this?" she asked, the word "this" dripping with enough condescension to freeze boiling water. "Mother, this is Sebastian," Chloe stated, forcing her voice into a register of calm confidence she absolutely did not possess. "He's a lead programmer at the firm, and we've been seeing each other for a few months." Evelyn let out a delicate, mocking sigh, her eyes fixing on his scuffed leather boots with undisguised distaste. A programmer. How quaint. I suppose the tech industry has its little niches, but we were hoping Chloe would finally settle down with someone who understands the complexities of real asset management. Without missing a beat, Sebastian offered a dazzling, predatory smile that belonged on a movie screen, not a coding floor. "True asset management is knowing when you've found something priceless and refusing to let it go, Mrs. Adams," he replied smoothly, lifting Chloe's hand and pressing a deliberate, lingering kiss to her knuckles. "I may deal in code, but I assure you, my algorithm for making your daughter happy is absolutely flawless." The utter audacity of his response left Evelyn temporarily speechless, her carefully painted lips parting in silent indignation, while Chloe felt a chaotic swirl of shock and dangerous admiration. This was not the socially awkward IT guy she had profiled in her risk assessment spreadsheets. This was a man who navigated verbal landmines with the lethal grace of a seasoned combatant. "Well, let's see how long that charming algorithm lasts when the reality of her lifestyle expectations sets in," her mother finally snapped, turning on her heel to summon the aunts for a tactical retreat. As soon as they were out of earshot, Chloe pulled her hand away from his, her analytical mind desperately trying to categorize the anomaly standing in front of her. "Where did you learn to lie with such terrifying fluency?" she asked, narrowing her eyes at the infuriatingly calm man who was now casually sipping a glass of champagne he had swiped from a passing tray. "I didn't lie about you being priceless, Chloe," Sebastian replied, his gaze dropping from her eyes to the plunging neckline of her emerald silk dress with a heat that made her breath catch. "But since we're currently exchanging services, I think it's time we renegotiate the terms of this little arrangement, because $500 severely underestimates my market value." Chloe crossed her arms defensively, her stoic facade firmly back in place, despite the chaotic fluttering in her chest. "We had a verbal agreement, Sebastian. You play the decoy for 3 hours, you take the check, and on Monday, we go back to ignoring each other by the espresso machine." He set his champagne flute down on a nearby high-top table, his towering frame suddenly blocking her view of the crowded ballroom, trapping her in a private, magnetic sphere of his own making. "Circumstances have evolved," he countered, his voice dropping into a register of pure, uncompromising business that sent off alarm bells in her head. "I have my own predators to avoid tonight. Corporate vultures who won't stop circling unless they think I'm completely occupied and off the market." Chloe stared at him, her sharp mind processing the discrepancy between his worn clothes and his sudden commanding vocabulary. "You want to use me as a human shield against a few overzealous tech recruiters," she scoffed, leaning in closer, refusing to be intimidated by his size. "Not recruiters," Sebastian murmured, his eyes scanning the room over her head with the cold, calculating precision of a sniper. "Let's just call them aggressive stakeholders. and I need a convincing, devoted girlfriend for the next 2 months to keep them completely blind to my actual operations." Her brain processed the request with the cold, hard logic she applied to every data set she analyzed for a living. Her family was orchestrating a massive, multi-tiered campaign to force her into a marriage with an arrogant, 50-something hedge fund manager named Vance. A move that would financially salvage her parents, but emotionally destroy her. Having a steady, believable boyfriend, one who was immune to her mother's venom and entirely outside their social circle, would provide her with the ultimate impenetrable armor. 2 months, she repeated slowly, her eyes narrowing as she calculated the variables, the risks, and the bizarrely tempting benefits of having this quick-witted giant by her side. You attend 3 family dinners, 1 dreaded charity auction, and you never, under any circumstances, try to interfere with my actual work or personal space. Sebastian's lips curved into a slow, devastatingly wicked smile that made her internal warning systems scream in red alert. "I agree to your boundaries, Advocate Adams, but you must attend 3 corporate galas with me, act completely smitten, and never ask questions about my schedule," he demanded, extending his large, calloused hand toward her. Chloe looked at his outstretched hand, recognizing the pivotal nature of this seemingly absurd transaction. It was a blind bet placed in the dark, driven by survival instincts rather than romantic inclination. She placed her hand in his, a sharp gasp catching in her throat, as his long fingers immediately closed around hers with an ironclad, possessive strength. "Deal," she whispered, her voice surprisingly breathless, as the heat of his grip radiated up her arm, burning away her carefully maintained stoicism. "But if you make me look like a fool in front of my family again, I will personally rewrite the code on your workstation to delete your existence." Sebastian chuckled, the deep vibration of it brushing against her skin as he stepped into her personal space, effortlessly pulling her back into the illusion of a deeply enamored couple. "I look forward to seeing you try, sweetheart," he murmured, his gaze locking onto hers with a dark, predatory promise that had absolutely nothing to do with programming. As they turned back to face the glittering, treacherous ballroom together, Chloe couldn't shake the terrifying, thrilling realization that in her desperate attempt to escape one trap, she had just walked willingly into the jaws of an infinitely more dangerous predator. The next morning, the neon-lit, high-stakes atmosphere of the Plaza Ballroom felt like a fever dream replaced by the crushing, gray reality of Monday at the office. Chloe sat at her workstation, her coffee barely touched as she stared at the glowing spreadsheets that usually anchored her sanity. But today, every line of data seemed to blur. She couldn't stop replaying the feeling of Sebastian's hand, warm, calloused, and alarmingly possessive, against her hip. It was a sensory variable she hadn't accounted for in her projections. Across the room, Sebastian was a study in controlled disarray. Leaning back in his chair with his feet propped up on his desk, apparently focused on a complex stack of code. Yet every 10 minutes he would glance over, catching her eye and offering a lazy, knowing smirk that was clearly designed to disrupt her concentration. It was maddening, and yet there was a hidden, sharper edge to his observation, a predatory intensity that didn't belong to a man who merely wrote scripts for inventory management systems. "Data sets are like human relationships, Chloe," Sebastian said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the open plan office, causing several colleagues to glance their way. He stood up, stretching with the languid, effortless strength of a large cat before walking over to her desk, his presence instantly shrinking the space between them. If you only look at the surface-level metrics, you miss the systemic corruption hidden in the subroutines. He leaned over her shoulder, his hand coming down to rest on the edge of her desk. His scent, wood smoke, and expensive, crisp mountain air enveloping her. He pointed to a specific anomaly in the quarterly growth projections for Sterling Equities, the very firm that Marcus Sterling managed. You're trying to find a pattern in a vacuum, but look at the transaction volume right before the market close. That's not organic growth. That's a pump and dump scheme masked as a routine trade. Chloe felt her breath catch, not just from the proximity of his body, but from the brutal, terrifying accuracy of his observation. "How do you know that?" she whispered, her voice dropping to a cautious, hushed tone as she realized he was describing an illegal financial maneuver she had struggled to identify for weeks. Sebastian straightened up, his green eyes glinting with a cold, analytical brilliance that she hadn't seen before. "I spend a lot of time reading between the lines of code, Chloe. You'd be surprised what people are willing to bury in the digital noise when they think nobody is paying attention." He leaned in closer, his voice a low, gravelly hum that vibrated through the air. "But that's why we're partners now, right? I provide the perspective, and you provide the surgical analysis. We're going to be a very effective team." He didn't wait for her response, instead tapping his fingers against her desk in a rhythmic, dismissive gesture before walking away. Chloe watched his back, her mind racing to categorize the strange dissonance in his character. He was a brilliant, possibly dangerous analyst, hiding in a low-level programming role, and she had just tied her professional and personal fate to his. The opportunity to test their partnership arrived sooner than expected when Chloe received a calendar invite for a high-pressure dinner with her parents, and Vance, the hedge fund manager her mother was determined to force upon her. It was the charity gala they had discussed, a breeding ground for social manipulation and aggressive networking. She spent hours in front of her mirror, dressed in a sleek crimson cocktail dress that looked like armor, trying to suppress the gnawing anxiety that threatened to consume her. When Sebastian arrived at her apartment to pick her up, he was unrecognizable. He had swapped the frayed tweed for a charcoal gray suit that accentuated his broad shoulders, and his dark hair was swept back, revealing a sharp, aristocratic profile that made her heart skip a frantic beat. "You look like you're heading to a board meeting," Chloe remarked, opening the door wider to let him in. "And you look like you're preparing for a tactical engagement," Sebastian countered, his gaze sweeping over her with a warmth that made her knees weak. "Just remember, all you have to do is look smitten and let me handle the sharks." The gala was held in a private conservatory overlooking the city, a lush, glass-enclosed garden that felt more like a stage set for a Greek tragedy. Vance, the man her mother was intent on pushing, was already there, holding court near the center fountain. His expensive suit and arrogant, predatory smile, a vivid reminder of why she was here. As they walked in, Sebastian didn't just stand by her side. He seamlessly took control of the space, his arm firmly around her waist, his posture radiating a quiet, dangerous authority that forced people to move out of their path. "There he is," Chloe hissed under her breath as she spotted Vance's smug expression shifting into a sneer as they approached. "Just stay calm, follow my lead, and don't, I repeat, don't make a scene." Sebastian chuckled, the deep sound vibrating through her spine as he stepped into the light of the main stage. "I don't make scenes, Chloe," he murmured, his thumb brushing against her back, in a rhythm meant to soothe her, even as it set her nerves on fire. "I just dismantle obstacles, and Vance is a very, very small obstacle." "Ah, Chloe," Vance drawled, stepping forward with an air of practiced, dismissive charm, his eyes raking over her before landing on Sebastian with overt disdain. "And I see you brought your little sidekick again." The insult hung in the air, a calculated strike designed to humiliate both of them in front of the surrounding crowd. Sebastian didn't blink, his expression remaining perfectly, terrifyingly blank as he tilted his head. "And I see you brought your ego, Vance," he replied, his voice calm, polite, and lethally sharp. "It really takes up so much space. It's a miracle anyone else can fit into this room." Vance's face flushed a deep, ugly red, his eyes narrowing. "You know, young man, it's remarkably easy to ruin a career in this city. A few phone calls to the right people, and suddenly you're back to flipping burgers." Sebastian didn't wait. He stepped forward, his body closing the distance until they were nose to nose, the air between them thick with unspoken, lethal tension. "You'd love that, wouldn't you, Marcus?" he said, using the name she had heard at the plaza, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "But you're confused. You're playing checkers while I've already finished the entire game." Chloe watched in stunned silence, her heart pounding as she realized the true depth of the deception. Vance looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, his mouth hanging open in a mixture of confusion and genuine fear. Sebastian turned back to Chloe, his face immediately softening into an expression of doting adoration that was so convincing she almost believed it herself. "I think the air in here has become entirely too toxic for my girlfriend," he said, his voice smooth and projecting, just enough for those nearby to hear. "Shall we find somewhere more civilized?" He took her hand, his grip warm and firm, and led her away from the stunned circle of onlookers, leaving Vance staring at them, completely unraveled. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of the conservatory, where a private, glass-enclosed balcony looked out over the sparkling, infinite city lights. The silence here was thick with the ghost of their confrontation, the residual tension of the performance still clinging to them like static. Chloe turned to face him, her eyes searching his face, trying to see past the mask he wore so effortlessly. "Who are you, Sebastian?" she asked, her voice quiet but piercingly direct. That wasn't just a witty comeback. You were dismantling him in a way that suggests you have a history, and a very powerful one. Sebastian took a step toward her, the cool, detached CEO facade flickering, revealing a raw, intense longing that terrified her. He reached out his hand, coming up to cup her face, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. "I'm the man who is currently enjoying the most complicated, fascinating, and infuriating relationship of his life." "Chloe," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Does the history really matter? Or is the fact that I'm the only one here protecting you enough?" His touch was electric, burning through her skin, and for a fraction of a second, Chloe's eyes fluttered shut. She felt something, a dangerous, undeniable spark, and she knew with a terrifying certainty that if she didn't walk away right now, she was going to be completely lost in the game she had helped to start. "It matters because I'm an analyst," she countered, her voice barely a whisper as she tried to force her heart to listen to her head. I don't play games without knowing the rules, and I don't build partnerships on secrets. Sebastian stepped closer, his body blocking out the rest of the world, his gaze pinning her to the cold glass of the balcony. Maybe some things are better left unsolved, Chloe, he said, his voice a low, rumbling caress that made her shiver. Maybe the thrill is in the risk, and maybe, just maybe, I'm not the predator in this scenario. Before she could respond, the gallows orchestra began to play a slow, haunting waltz, the notes drifting through the open doors and filling the space between them. He extended his hand, his eyes burning with an unspoken, intense hunger. One dance, Chloe, he urged, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming need. Just one dance, and then you can analyze me as much as you want. Against every logical, self-preserving instinct in her body, Chloe reached out and took his hand, the heat of his skin radiating through her own. As he pulled her into his arms, the music, the lights, the entire world seemed to melt away, leaving only the two of them trapped in a dangerous, beautiful, and absolutely exhilarating performance that felt more real than the ground beneath their feet. The music swelled, wrapping around them like a silken trap as they moved across the glass-enclosed balcony. Chloe's breath hitched, her logical mind screaming to pull away, but her body betrayed her, melting against the solid, unyielding lines of Sebastian's frame. He didn't dance like a programmer who spent his days hunched over a keyboard. He moved with the predatory, calculated grace of a man who owned the very floor he walked on. His hand, wide and warm, rested firmly on the bare skin of her back, sending a cascade of terrifying electricity straight to her core. She looked up, intending to demand space to enforce the strict boundaries of their fabricated arrangement. But the raw, unfiltered hunger in his jade eyes silenced her completely. He wasn't acting anymore. The cool, detached mask had shattered, leaving only a dark, consuming intensity that pinned her in place under the glittering chandelier. He lowered his head, his lips hovering mere millimeters from hers, the heat of his breath mingling with her own. "I warned you," he murmured, his voice a gravelly rasp that vibrated against her mouth. "Some risks are worth taking." And then he kissed her. It wasn't the polite, performative brush of lips they had shared for her mother. It was a devastating, total surrender. He kissed her with a starvation that devoured all her carefully constructed algorithms, his hands tangling fiercely in her hair, pulling her into a freefall of pure, illogical sensation. The kiss severed her tether to reality, obliterating the boundaries of their contract in a single, catastrophic collision of heat and desire. Chloe kissed him back with equal desperation, her fingers gripping the lapels of his expensive suit, anchoring herself to the storm she had willingly walked into. When he finally broke the kiss, his chest heaving, his forehead came to rest against hers. They stood there in the shadows of the balcony, the glittering skyline of New York suddenly insignificant compared to the seismic shift between them. Sebastian, she breathed the name, tasting entirely different now, heavy with implications she wasn't prepared to analyze. He slowly opened his eyes, the fierce possessiveness in them making her heart hammer violently against her ribs. He didn't apologize. He didn't brush it off as part of the act. "We need to leave," he stated, his voice tight, rough with restrained control. The ride back to her apartment was a suffocating vacuum of silence, the air in the sleek town car practically humming with unspoken words. He didn't walk her to her door, merely waiting on the curb until she was safely inside. A brooding sentinel standing guard in the cold night. The safety of her apartment offered no solace. The silence only amplified the chaotic, frantic beating of her heart. Chloe paced the length of her small living room, the memory of his mouth burning on hers, completely dismantling the stoic armor she had worn for years. She needed control. She needed the cold, unfeeling comfort of numbers and absolute certainties. Stripping off the crimson dress, she threw on an oversized sweater and violently flipped open her laptop on the kitchen island. Days ago, under the guise of needing help with a side project, Sebastian had casually handed her an encrypted flash drive, asking her to run a predictive algorithm on a massive set of unstructured financial data. She had treated it as a favor for her fake boyfriend, a puzzle to solve during her lunch breaks. Now, staring at the flashing cursor, she attacked the data set with the ferocity of a woman desperate for a distraction. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, writing advanced sorting scripts that stripped away the layers of obfuscation, digging into the raw, unfiltered truth hidden beneath the digital noise. As the progress bar inched toward completion, the chaotic variables began to align, forming a terrifying, unmistakable pattern. Chloe leaned closer to the screen, her brow furrowing as the cold, hard logic of the numbers finally eclipsed the emotional turmoil of the evening. This wasn't a hypothetical side project. These were real, highly classified transaction logs detailing a massive, systemic asset-stripping operation. The dummy corporations, the offshore accounts, the aggressive short-selling patterns, they all pointed directly to the firm they had just left at the gala. Sterling Equities, Vance's syndicate. Her blood ran ice cold as she traced the digital breadcrumbs her mind, connecting the dots with horrifying clarity. Why would a low-level programmer at her firm have access to the dark ledger of one of Wall Street's most ruthless predators? The confrontation on the balcony replayed in her mind. Sebastian's lethal confidence, the way Vance had paled in genuine terror. Sebastian hadn't been defending her from an arrogant suitor. He had been staring down a corporate enemy. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like copper in the back of her throat. She initiated a deep dive cross-reference, bypassing the firm's standard firewalls, pulling public registry data against the shell companies listed in the decrypted file. The code Sebastian had written to hide this data was a masterpiece, but her forensic analysis was flawless. Line by line, the proxies fell away, revealing the true target of the hostile takeover Vance was orchestrating. It wasn't a rival hedge fund. It was Wright Holdings, a multinational tech conglomerate worth billions. Chloe stared at the name of the elusive CEO, a man famously reclusive, a ghost who controlled algorithms that ran half the world's logistics. Sebastian Wright. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. The frayed tweed jackets, the Tupperware lunches, the $500 check. It was all a brilliantly executed camouflage. She hadn't hired a convenient decoy. She had invited a billionaire apex predator into her life, and he had turned her into an unwitting accomplice in his war. The next morning, the fluorescent lights of the office felt like harsh interrogation lamps. Chloe marched through the bullpen, her posture rigidly perfect, her eyes fixed entirely on the man slouched at the corner desk. Sebastian looked up as she approached, his jaw shadowed with stubble, the memory of last night's kiss lingering in the dark, heavy gaze he fixed upon her. She didn't say a word. She grabbed his arm, her grip shockingly strong, and hauled him toward the soundproof glass conference room at the end of the hall. He followed without resistance, an amused, dangerous smirk playing on his lips, until she slammed the door shut and yanked the blinds down, sealing them in. She threw the encrypted flash drive onto the center of the glass table. It hit the surface with a sharp, definitive crack. "You didn't hire a fake girlfriend, Sebastian," Chloe said, her voice a low, vibrating hum of pure, contained fury. "You hired a blind forensic accountant to launder your corporate espionage." The lazy, unbothered programmer vanished in the blink of an eye. The air in the small room instantly grew heavy, thick with the crushing, overwhelming gravity of the man he truly was. Sebastian stood to his full height, his broad shoulders blocking the door, effectively trapping her, with the billionaire CEO of Wright Holdings. He didn't look apologetic. He looked like a general assessing a battlefield. "You cracked the encryption faster than I anticipated, Advocate Adams," he stated, his voice devoid of any warmth, sharp and precise as a scalpel. "I needed someone entirely outside my executive circle. Someone brilliant enough to process the data, but isolated enough not to trigger the board's internal alarms." Chloe felt a sickening wave of betrayal wash over her. "You used me. My mother's obsession with Vance, the gala, the confrontation, you knew all of it. You knew Sterling's syndicate was targeting your company, and you used our arrangement to get close enough to steal their ledger without them noticing. I didn't engineer your family's greed, Chloe, but I absolutely capitalized on it," Sebastian shot back, closing the distance between them, his towering presence forcing her to back up against the edge of the conference table. "Sterling has a rat inside my boardroom, a traitor, bleeding my empire dry from the inside out, and I needed hard, irrefutable proof before I tore them all to the ground." He planted his hands on the table on either side of her, trapping her in a cage of heat and power. The anger in his eyes warred with something much deeper, a raw, desperate intensity that made her breath hitch. "I used you as a shield, yes. But last night on that balcony, when I kissed you, I broke every single rule of my own survival." He leaned in, his face inches from hers, the terrifying truth of his identity colliding with the undeniable reality of his desire. "I didn't plan for you, Chloe. You were supposed to be a temporary variable, but now you're the only person in this entire God-forsaken city I actually trust. And if you walk away now, they won't just ruin me, they will absolutely ruin you." The cold, brutal logic of his warning pierced through the fog of her anger. Vance wasn't just a sleazy suitor. He was a corporate criminal who now believed she was intimately connected to the man trying to destroy him. By decrypting the data, she had unknowingly painted a massive target on her own back. Chloe stared up into Sebastian's eyes, seeing the ruthless titan and the desperate man seamlessly intertwined. She could run, she could expose him, or she could stand her ground and fight. Her stoicism, forged by years of analyzing risk, crystallized into a sudden, terrifying resolve. She didn't shrink away from his imposing frame. Instead, she reached out, grabbing the lapels of his suit, pulling him fractionally closer. "If I stay in this game right, I am no longer your decoy," Chloe commanded, her voice steady, refusing to yield a single inch of power. "I am your partner. We play with all the cards face up on the table, or I take this data and burn you both to the ground." Sebastian's eyes flared with dark, exhilarating triumph. "Deal," he whispered, capturing her mouth in a punishing, sealing kiss that marked the true beginning of their war. The atmosphere inside the conference room shifted from an interrogation to a war room as the cold fluorescent light reflected off the polished glass. Sebastian moved to the head of the table, his movements no longer those of a bumbling programmer, but of a man who commanded global logistics and multi-billion-dollar interests. He pulled up a secure dashboard on the table's interface, revealing the full tangled web of shell companies and offshore accounts that Vance had been using to slowly drain his company's reserves. "This is the leverage we have," Sebastian said, his voice now entirely stripped of emotion, the voice of the man who had been hunting the saboteur for months. He pointed to a series of wire transfers that led directly to a dummy account linked to a luxury penthouse in Manhattan, a property registered under the name of a distant relative of Chloe's own mother. The realization hit Chloe like a physical blow. Her mother wasn't just hounding her to marry Vance for money. She was the unwitting, or perhaps willing, conduit for the money being stolen from Sebastian. "My mother," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the cooling fans, the betrayal settling into her bones with a sickening heavy weight. "She didn't just want me to marry him. She was laundering the funds from this sabotage through the accounts she manages for my father." Sebastian didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply watched her, his expression a mix of raw empathy and clinical observation. He knew that for someone like Chloe, whose entire life was governed by the integrity of her data and her own self-discipline, this discovery was a structural failure of her entire world. "She's a pawn, Chloe, just like I was trying to keep you from becoming," he said, moving to stand beside her, his presence a grounding force in the storm of her realization. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small encrypted key, setting it on the table. "This is the master key to the ledger. If we upload this to the SEC's portal, we don't just stop Vance. We burn the whole network down, including your mother's involvement." The risk was absolute, and the stakes were non-negotiable. Uploading the files would save Sebastian's company, but it would inevitably lead to a federal investigation that would dismantle her family's social standing and land her parents in prison for their role in the embezzlement. Chloe stared at the key, her hands trembling as the weight of the moral dilemma pressed down on her with suffocating force. She had spent her life trying to escape her family's shadow, but she had never wanted to destroy them completely. Yet the data was irrefutable. Sebastian watched her, his hand hovering over the table, giving her the space to make the call. The ultimate test of her character and her allegiance. "I need you to decide," he whispered, his voice uncharacteristically soft, stripped of all the arrogance and the games. "I can find another way to handle Vance, but it will take months, and they will continue to bleed my company dry, or we end this today." For the first time in their alliance, Chloe didn't look at the data or the spreadsheets. She looked at the man who had laid his heart on the line for her at the diner. She saw the man who had turned from a predator to a protector, and she understood that the life of control she had led was exactly what had allowed people like Vance and her mother to manipulate her so easily. She had been a variable they thought they could predict, but she was now the one who held the outcome. "Upload it," she commanded, her voice steady, the fear replaced by a cold, sharpened sense of justice. She didn't choose her family. She chose the truth and the man who had helped her find the courage to confront it. As the upload bar began to crawl across the screen, the sirens of federal agents approaching the office building began to echo in the distance. the sound a final, irrevocable signal that their game of shadows was coming to an end. Sebastian grabbed her hand, his eyes burning with a mixture of relief and intense burning pride as he realized she was stronger than any variable he could have calculated. "Are you ready for the fallout?" he asked, his voice low, his fingers lacing through hers. Chloe didn't look back at the screen or the office they were about to lose. She looked at the man who had challenged her to be real. "I'm ready for the truth, Sebastian," she replied, her voice firm, the fear of the future replaced by the exhilaration of finally being free of the lie. The glass doors of the conference room burst open, but it wasn't the police. It was Vance, flanked by 2 security goons, his face twisted in a mask of manic, desperate fury. "You think you can play God with my finances, you scruffy little rat?" he screamed, his voice cracking as he lunged toward the table with a concealed weapon pulled from his jacket. Sebastian didn't hesitate, his reaction instantaneous. He shoved Chloe behind him with a force that was all protective instinct and zero calculation. He met the man's lunge with a brutal, efficient strike that sent the weapon skittering across the floor, and Vance crashing into the far wall. The security guards hesitated, clearly not prepared for the speed or the raw, cold rage radiating from the man they believed was merely an IT programmer. Sebastian pinned Vance to the wall, his hand locked tight against the man's throat, his face a mask of terrifying, calm menace. "You forgot one crucial variable in your little scheme, Marcus," he growled, the billionaire CEO's true voice freezing the room. "You didn't just target my company. You threatened the only thing I have ever truly valued." He looked over his shoulder at Chloe, his eyes dark with an emotion that was entirely raw and entirely terrifying. "And that was your final mistake." The federal agents swarmed the boardroom seconds after the scuffle, their presence a blur of dark windbreakers and tactical precision that effectively ended the reign of sterling equities. Vance was hauled away, his shouts of rage muffled by the chaos of the scene, while Sebastian remained standing in the center of the room, his posture radiating a calm, absolute authority that made even the lead investigator pause. Chloe watched from the sidelines, feeling a profound, soul-deep sense of release. The weight that had been crushing her chest for months evaporated, leaving behind a terrifying, beautiful clarity. Her phone didn't stop buzzing with frantic messages from her mother, but she silenced it with a single decisive flick, choosing to let the silence of the room be her only response. Sebastian walked toward her, his gaze intense and searching, his hand coming up to gently tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. A gesture so intimate and gentle, it felt out of place in the sterile, wreckage-strewn office. "It's done," he murmured, his voice a low, steady anchor in the fading aftermath of the crisis. "The network is severed, and you are finally free of them." The transition into the weeks that followed was a surreal, high-speed blur of depositions, public apologies, and the slow, necessary process of rebuilding their lives from the ashes of the corporate scandal. Sebastian stepped fully into his role as the CEO of Wright Holdings, his life now a demanding schedule of media interviews and high-level strategy sessions. Yet he never once let the distance return. Every evening, he returned to their temporary living arrangement, a secure estate far from the prying eyes of the press, and found her. His eyes full of a love he no longer tried to suppress. He took a genuine interest in her future, supporting her decision to leave the analytical world behind and pursue her own path, offering resources not as a bribe, but as a silent, unwavering vote of confidence. Their relationship had moved beyond the constraints of a contract. It was now a partnership, forged in the fire of truth, built on the mutual terrifying recognition that they had finally found the one thing they had both spent their lives pretending they didn't need. One evening, about 2 months after the dust had settled, Sebastian came home with a mysterious, soft smile that mirrored the one he had worn that night on the balcony. "I have something to show you," he said, his voice laced with a secret, as he led her toward the private elevator that serviced the penthouse. He took her back to the hotel where their strange, complicated story had begun, but he didn't lead her to the lobby or the grand entrance. Instead, he took them up to a stunning, private rooftop terrace that had been closed to the public for the night. The terrace was empty, save for a single table set for two, surrounded by hundreds of flickering, warm white candles that made the city lights below look like a sea of fallen stars. In the corner, a lone violinist was playing a soft, hauntingly beautiful melody, the same one that had played that night on the balcony. "Sebastian, what is all this?" Chloe breathed, feeling completely overwhelmed by the breathtaking display. "Our contract is officially, legally, and permanently voided," he began, his voice low and serious, taking her hands in his. "But I find myself wanting to propose a new, much more permanent arrangement." He slowly got down on one knee, the billionaire who commanded boardrooms and global markets now kneeling before her under the infinite, starlit sky. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, and inside was a ring, a delicate, elegant band with a single perfect pear-cut diamond that caught the candlelight and splintered it into 1,000 tiny, dancing rainbows. "Chloe Adams," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he made no attempt to hide. "You came into my life as a variable I tried to control, and you became the only certainty I have ever known. You taught me that a life without risk is a life without joy, and a heart without love is just a cold, logical machine. Will you marry me for real this time? No clauses, no conditions, no expiration date." Tears of pure, unadulterated joy streamed down her face as she laughed and cried simultaneously, the weight of the last few months finally giving way to a future that felt bright, honest, and entirely their own. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with happiness as she reached for his hand. "Yes, of course, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit that felt less like jewelry and more like a final, unbreakable seal. He stood up, pulling her into his arms, their kiss a deep, promise-filled vow that held the weight of a lifetime, the past and its lies dissolving into the absolute truth of their present. 1 year later, Chloe stood in the same garden where they had first truly connected, the air smelling of blooming jasmine and success. Their wedding was an intimate, beautiful affair, attended only by the few people who had truly seen them through the fire. Chloe's mother, humbled and changed by the ordeal, sat in the front row holding her hand, while Sebastian's own family watched from the sidelines, finally respecting the independent, unyielding woman he had chosen. As Chloe walked down the aisle, she only had eyes for Sebastian, who stood waiting for her, his eyes full of an adoring, unguarded light meant only for her. Their vows were simple, heartfelt, and deeply personal, filled with promises that carried the weight of their unique, hard-won journey. Later, at the reception, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the happy, intimate group, Sebastian pulled her away for a quiet moment. They stood by a small, bubbling fountain, the sound of the water a peaceful counterpoint to the distant laughter. "I have a final piece of business for you," he said, a mischievous, loving glint in his eye. He reached into the pocket of his tuxedo and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, a scrap from a notebook they had used for their first messy, improvised plan. "Our true final contract," he said, handing it to her. She unfolded it and found a single, bold sentence written in his handwriting. "Party A, Sebastian, and Party B, Chloe, hereby agree to love, cherish, and defy all odds, joyfully and with extreme prejudice, every single day for the rest of their lives." Below it were 2 lines for their signatures. Chloe laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed in the quiet, golden twilight. "This is the best contract you've ever written," she said, her voice full of a love so deep it felt bottomless. He produced a pen from his pocket, his gaze locked on hers. "Shall we make it official?" They leaned against the cool marble of the fountain, using it as a makeshift desk, and signed their names with steady, certain hands. He took the paper from her, folded it carefully, and placed it back in his pocket, close to his heart. "Binding for a lifetime," he said, his voice full of a love so deep it was bottomless. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her a slow, sweet, promise-filled kiss that held all the warmth and beauty of their future. Their story had started with a desperate, calculated lie in a crowded room, a game of pretend with impossible, cold-hearted rules. But it had ended here with a truth written on a scrap of paper, a testament to the beautiful, undeniable fact that the best rules in life are the ones that are broken by love.